Jake had been away for several hours, running errands and taking care of small tasks around town. It wasn't much, just a normal trip to pick up a few things he needed, but it gave him the peace he craved after a busy week. When he pulled up into his driveway, he was looking forward to a quiet evening at home. He expected his garage to be just like it always was, empty, ready for his car. But as he turned onto his street and approached his house, something felt wrong. He noticed a car in his garage. Not just any car, a car he recognized all too well. It was Karen's, the HOA president. The woman who had made his life a constant battle with her petty rules and unreasonable demands. His blood boiled the moment he saw it. His garage, his personal space, was being used by someone who didn't respect him, didn't respect his boundaries, and thought she could do whatever she wanted just because of her position in the HOA. Jake slammed his car into park and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He didn't know whether he was more frustrated by the fact that she had taken his space or by how brazen she had been about it. He had asked her, time and time again, to respect his property, to follow the rules. But she had ignored every request, every polite conversation, and every warning. She didn't care. She never had. And now, here she was, parking in his space like it was hers. The nerve. Jake felt his anger rising, his mind racing. This wasn't just a matter of someone parking in his garage. This was about respect. About boundaries. About someone believing they could walk all over him just because they held some power in the community. He got out of the car and stood there for a moment, looking at the car in his garage. He wanted to do something, anything, to fix this situation right now. But something inside of him told him to stay calm. This wasn't the time to act rashly. If he wanted to teach Karen a lesson, he needed to be smart. He needed a plan. He wasn't just going to yell at her or get into a confrontation. That wasn't going to work. Karen wasn't the type of person to listen to reason. She didn't care about other people's feelings or their property. She only cared about what she could control. So, Jake would have to find another way to show her that there were consequences for her actions. Something that would make her think twice before ever doing this again. Jake's frustration slowly turned into determination as he thought of a plan. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. He stood there for a moment, just thinking about his options. Karen had parked her car in his garage, but that wasn't the real issue. The issue was that she had taken advantage of her position. She used the HOA to push people around, make unreasonable demands, and intimidate anyone who dared to question her. Jake wasn't the first person she had done this to. He wasn't even the first person who had asked her to respect their space. She had bullied neighbors into submission with her petty rules, and now it was Jake's turn to deal with her. But Jake wasn't going to be intimidated. Not by her, and certainly not by her car sitting in his garage. He turned and walked back to the front door, taking slow, deliberate steps. His mind was already planning what he would do next. He didn't need to confront her right away. No, that would be a mistake. Instead, he needed to get inside, get organized, and come up with a way to deal with this that would show her she couldn't just do whatever she wanted. He was done being a doormat. He would teach Karen a lesson, one she wouldn't forget. As Jake entered his home, he walked into the living room and sat down at the table. He opened his laptop, pretending to get back to work, but his mind wasn't focused on what was in front of him. His mind was still on the car in the garage, still on the way Karen had acted like she owned everything. The longer he thought about it, the more ideas popped into his head. He didn't know what exactly he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing. It was going to be something clever. Something that would make Karen feel the consequences of her actions. Jake had always been the type to think things through. He didn't let his anger control him, at least not completely. But today, as he sat at his desk, the anger simmered just below the surface, ready to boil over. It wasn't just about the car in his garage. It was about standing up for himself, about refusing to let someone like Karen treat him like he was beneath her. He was tired of being pushed around. He was tired of Karen thinking she could just walk into his life and make it miserable. But more than anything, Jake was tired of people like her thinking they were untouchable. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with this, not without teaching her that her actions had consequences. He couldn't just let her think she could walk all over him anymore. He had to make her realize that there were limits, and that she had crossed them. He stood up from the desk, took a deep breath, and went to the window. He looked out at the driveway again, at Karen's car still parked in his garage, and he smiled to himself. He wasn't sure how long this would take, or what exactly would happen next, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let Karen get the best of him. Not today. Not ever again. Jake sat at his desk, his mind still racing. The image of Karen's car parked in his garage wouldn't leave him. It was as if it had burned itself into his brain. He was used to Karen's antics, the petty complaints, the constant HOA rules, her sense of entitlement, but this was different. This wasn't just an annoyance. This was an invasion. His space, his privacy, had been violated, and Jake wasn't about to let that slide. He could feel his anger slowly turning into something else, something calmer, something more controlled. He knew he had to think this through, be strategic. Reacting impulsively would only make things worse. No, Karen was playing a game, but Jake was smarter than that. He had to play his own game, and he was going to make sure that when the dust settled, Karen would know exactly who she was dealing with. He leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. His mind was already working, and ideas started to form. He could hear Karen's voice in his head. All those times she had made demands, acted like she was the one in charge. She thought she could do whatever she wanted because she had the HOA behind her. Well, that was about to change. Jake wasn't afraid of her or her position. He had a plan now, a plan that would make Karen regret ever parking in his garage. It wasn't going to be about anger. It was going to be about control, about showing her that she couldn't just walk over him anymore. He thought back to the dozens of times Karen had acted like she owned the neighborhood, like everyone else was beneath her. And that smug look she always had on her face when she thought she was untouchable. It was time to take that down a notch. Jake wasn't going to rush in like some hothead, but he was going to make sure Karen knew that her behavior had consequences. He had a few tricks up his sleeve. The first step was simple: patience. Karen had no idea that Jake wasn't the type of person to get swept up in the heat of the moment. He was calm, collected, and more importantly, he knew how to get what he wanted without playing by her rules. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, his eyes narrowing as he looked out at the garage. Karen's car was still there, occupying the space that was supposed to be his. The feeling of ownership, the sense of invasion, settled back in his chest. But now, it didn't just feel like frustration. It felt like opportunity. Jake wasn't going to just ask Karen to leave his garage. No, he needed to make a statement. He needed to teach her a lesson she would never forget. His thoughts turned back to the garage, and an idea began to form in his mind. Karen would realize that there was no such thing as invincibility when it came to other people's property. But he had to act fast. He wasn't going to give her the chance to realize she had won before he made his move. He walked to the door and stepped outside, his mind already working through the logistics. He was ready now. As Jake moved toward the garage, the idea took shape. It was so simple, yet so effective. Karen had parked in his space, thinking she could just waltz in and do whatever she wanted. Well, she was about to learn that there were boundaries, and she had just crossed one. He pulled the garage door shut with a loud clank, his fingers running over the keys in his pocket as he locked it behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place was like music to his ears. Karen was inside his garage, and she wasn't going anywhere for a while. The moment he locked the door, Jake felt a rush of satisfaction. It wasn't an act of revenge. It wasn't about getting back at Karen. It was about taking control, showing her that she couldn't just come and go as she pleased. She thought her position in the HOA gave her power. Well, today, Jake would remind her of the one thing she couldn't control: the consequences of her actions. Jake stood there for a moment, considering the situation. He had no intention of confronting her directly, not yet anyway. She would have to realize what was happening before she could do anything about it. Karen wouldn't be able to just call for help. She couldn't threaten him or demand that he fix the situation. He had locked the door, and now she was at his mercy. The power dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the one at her mercy. Now, she would have to deal with him. Jake walked back inside the house, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He wasn't sure how long Karen would be stuck there, but it didn't matter. The point was made. As he settled back into his chair, Jake's mind raced with what would come next. This wasn't just about the garage anymore. This was about standing up for himself, about showing Karen that there were real consequences when you pushed people too far. He wasn't going to back down. He had locked the door, but it wasn't just about locking her out. It was about locking her in her own delusions. Jake knew this wasn't the end. Karen would try to fight back. She would call the police, she would complain to the HOA, and she might even try to pull some strings to get herself out of the mess. But Jake wasn't worried. He had the upper hand now, and he wasn't going to let it slip. He would make sure that Karen learned a lesson she would never forget. The real fun was just beginning. Jake's mind was racing as he paced around his house. It had been a few hours since he locked Karen in his garage, and while part of him felt satisfaction, another part of him couldn't help but wonder what Karen was thinking. He had made his move, but now he had to let the situation play out. Jake wasn't sure how long she would stay in there, or how long it would take for her to realize what had happened. What he did know was that he wasn't about to let her off easily. The sound of his phone buzzing snapped him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his neighbor, Mike, who had always kept an eye on things for him. "Jake, you won't believe this. Karen just showed up here, banging on my door. She's asking for your help to get her car out of the garage. She said you locked her in." Mike's message confirmed Jake's suspicion. Karen was already starting to panic. He could almost hear her voice, full of outrage, demanding to be let out. She had always been someone who thought she could control everyone around her, but now the tables had turned. Jake smiled to himself, imagining Karen's face when she realized she had no choice but to wait for him to open the door. Her sense of entitlement had finally met its match. Karen thought she could park in Jake's garage whenever she felt like it, but she was going to learn the hard way that nobody was above the rules, not even her. The fact that she was stuck, unable to get out of the garage, filled Jake with a quiet sense of victory. He could only imagine how frustrated and humiliated she must be right now. Her car, the one she had so casually parked in his space, was now trapped, and she had no way out. As the hours passed, Jake kept checking his phone for any updates. He wanted to see if Karen was still trying to get help. Sure enough, a few minutes later, he received another text from Mike. "Karen's trying to get a tow truck here. She says you can't just lock her in. She's calling the cops too." Jake rolled his eyes. The audacity of it all. Of course, Karen was trying to use her connections, trying to force people to side with her. But this time, things were different. The law wasn't on her side, and no amount of manipulation was going to change that. He sat back down at his desk, reflecting on how far he'd come. Jake had spent months dealing with Karen's incessant demands. She had always used her position in the HOA to push people around, making life miserable for anyone who didn't follow her rules to the letter. The endless fines, the complaints about his property, the constant interference, it was exhausting. And when Karen's son broke into Jake's house, it was the final straw. The disrespect, the entitlement, Jake had had enough. He didn't want to cause trouble, but at some point, standing up for yourself became the only option. That's when Jake decided he'd had enough. If Karen wanted to play dirty, then he was more than willing to join her game. He wasn't going to let her think she could do whatever she wanted without facing consequences. As Jake sat there, the minutes slowly passed. He could almost picture Karen inside his garage, pacing, trying to figure out how to get out. She had never been in a position like this before, where she wasn't in control. It was a feeling Jake knew well, having his property constantly scrutinized by her, being the one on the receiving end of her demands. But now, the roles had reversed. And Jake was going to make sure Karen knew exactly what it felt like to be helpless. Hours later, Jake's phone buzzed again, this time a call from Karen herself. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Jake, you need to let me out of this garage." Karen's voice came through the phone, filled with frustration. "This is ridiculous. I'm not some criminal. Let me out right now, or I'll make you pay for this." Her voice had lost the usual calm authority it always held. Now, she sounded desperate, trying to regain some control of the situation. Jake leaned back in his chair, his voice steady as he responded. No, Karen. You've had your chance. You parked in my garage without permission. You didn't listen when I told you to stop. So now, you're going to learn that there are consequences for that. Karen's voice cracked. This is insane. You can't just lock me in here. I'm the HOA president. I'll make sure you regret this. Jake didn't flinch. He was done being intimidated. Maybe you'll think twice before doing this to someone else. I'm not backing down. You need to stay there until I decide otherwise. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake could hear Karen's angry breathing, but he stayed silent, letting her stew in her frustration. You'll regret this, she finally spat, before hanging up. Jake smiled to himself, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't being petty. He wasn't doing this out of anger. He was showing Karen that she couldn't just walk all over people and expect no consequences. This was his moment to take a stand. This wasn't just about locking her out of his garage. This was about making sure she understood that she couldn't control everything, especially not him. As Jake sat back, he thought about the days ahead. Karen would be calling for help, calling her HOA allies, trying to figure out how to get her car out. But Jake wasn't going to give in. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. For once, Jake felt in control of the situation, and it felt good. The next few days were going to be interesting. Karen would learn, in time, that her position didn't give her the right to treat people however she wanted. And Jake was going to make sure of it. Jake had been expecting this. He knew Karen wouldn't stay locked in the garage for long before she started reaching out. And sure enough, he'd already received multiple calls from her over the past hour. But he hadn't answered. He wasn't about to make this easy for her. Every time his phone buzzed, he glanced at the screen, watching as Karen's name flashed up. But he let it go to voicemail. He wasn't ready to speak to her. Not yet. As Jake sat at his desk, the minutes seemed to stretch on forever. He could feel the calm before the storm. Karen was probably furious, pacing around, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. He could almost picture her. The frustration, the helplessness in her eyes as she realized there was nothing she could do. The HOA president, always in control, now completely powerless. The irony of it wasn't lost on Jake. For once, Karen was the one at the mercy of someone else. She had spent years using her position to intimidate people, to get what she wanted without consequences. But today was different. Today, she was the one being forced to face the consequences. Jake leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the wood as he thought about what to do next. He had made his point, but he knew Karen wasn't going to let this slide without trying something more. She would escalate things. She would call in her allies, start pulling strings to get herself out of this. But Jake wasn't worried. He had planned for this. He knew what she was capable of, and he had made sure his move was untraceable. The next few days were going to be key. As the evening wore on, Jake could hear the sounds of Karen trying to figure out a way out. The sound of a car engine revving up outside. Maybe she had tried to call a tow truck. Maybe she was still hoping someone would come to her rescue. Jake couldn't help but smirk. He had the advantage now. No one was coming to save her. The longer Karen stayed stuck in the garage, the more she would realize just how powerless she really was. The phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't Karen. It was a message from his neighbor, Mike. Jake, Karen just showed up at my house asking if I could help her get out. I told her I didn't want any part of it, but she's trying to get someone to tow the car. She's losing it, man. Jake read the message with a smirk on his face. Karen was probably fuming by now, and the thought of her desperation made Jake feel a sense of satisfaction. But it wasn't over. He needed to keep his cool and stay one step ahead. He didn't plan on letting her off easy. He wasn't about to give in just because she was throwing a tantrum. He was going to let her stew in her frustration for as long as it took. Let her think about it for a while, Jake replied to Mike. She'll figure it out eventually. I'm not going to make it easy for her. He placed his phone down and leaned back in his chair, thinking about the days ahead. Karen would keep trying, and Jake had no doubt that she would escalate things. She would go to the HOA, she would call the police, she would demand that Jake be punished. But no matter what she did, Jake knew she wouldn't win. Not this time. She couldn't control the situation anymore. Jake had outsmarted her, and now, he was going to make sure she knew what it felt like to be powerless. Hours passed, and Jake didn't hear much more from Karen. He figured she had finally realized that there was no easy way out of this situation. She could try all she wanted, but she was stuck. And the longer she stayed stuck, the more she would have to confront the reality of what she had done. Jake decided to take a walk, get some fresh air. He stepped outside, looking at the quiet neighborhood around him. The sun was starting to set, casting a soft orange glow over the houses. As he walked down the street, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over him. He had done something few people ever dared to do. He had taken a stand. And it felt good. He didn't want to get caught up in petty revenge. But what he had done was necessary. Karen needed to learn that she couldn't just walk all over people because of her position. She needed to understand that her actions had consequences. As Jake continued his walk, he made up his mind. He would give her one more chance to back down. He wasn't going to let this drag on forever. But she had to understand that there was a limit to how far she could push people before they fought back. It was a lesson that Karen had never learned. It was time she did. By the time Jake returned home, the sun had fully set, and the house felt peaceful again. Karen's car was still in the garage, still locked inside. But now, Jake felt like the situation had turned in his favor. The frustration that had been building inside him was gone. The anger had settled. And now it was just a matter of watching Karen come to terms with the fact that she wasn't in control anymore. She was just like everyone else, vulnerable to the consequences of her own actions. And that was the most satisfying feeling of all. Jake had not anticipated how long it would take Karen to fully understand what was happening. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call from Mike, his neighbor. Jake knew what it meant before he even picked up the phone. "Jake, you're not going to believe this," Mike said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Karen just called the cops. She's telling them you've stolen her car and locked her in the garage." Jake couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Karen had gone from being entitled to downright desperate. Did she really think the police would believe that? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but the amusement was evident. Mike sighed, his voice tinged with concern. "I don't know, man. She's making it sound like you trapped her or something. You should probably be careful. I don't want to see you get into more trouble over this." Jake stopped walking and leaned against the railing of his porch, his thoughts racing. The fact that Karen had called the police wasn't surprising. She was the type of person who thought she could manipulate the system, always assuming that her influence would get her out of any situation. But now she had made a mistake. Jake knew the police would take her claims seriously, at least at first, but they also knew the truth. There was no theft, no malicious intent. Karen had been locked in the garage because of her own actions. She had parked her car in Jake's space without permission, and now she was reaping the consequences. Jake was in the right. He had to stay calm, and he had to make sure he didn't let Karen's antics mess with his life. "I'll handle it," Jake said to Mike. "Don't worry. I've got it under control." "All right, man. Just be careful," Mike warned before ending the call. Jake stood there for a moment, the cool evening air washing over him. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful even, and the thought that Karen was trapped in his garage, unable to get out, gave him an unexpected sense of satisfaction. But the situation wasn't over yet. Karen had escalated it by involving the police, and now he had to be ready for whatever came next. Jake took a deep breath and decided to call his lawyer, just to make sure everything was in order. He needed to be prepared, to make sure there were no loose ends in his plan. As the phone rang, Jake paced back and forth, his thoughts focused on the upcoming encounter. He didn't know when the police would show up, but he knew he needed to be ready. "Hello." His lawyer answered, sounding like he had just woken up. "It's Jake," he said, his voice calm but determined. Karen's trying to make a big deal out of the garage situation. She called the cops, and I'm sure she's telling them I locked her in there. His lawyer paused for a moment before replying. If she's trying to say you kidnapped her or something, that's a stretch. You're within your rights to protect your property. But be prepared for her to try anything to make you look bad. I'd suggest getting any evidence you can, like witnesses who saw her park in your garage or any video footage if you have it. Jake nodded even though his lawyer couldn't see him. I'll get it. I'm not going to let her spin this into something it's not. As he hung up, Jake realized the stakes were higher than he had thought. Karen wasn't just trying to get out of the garage. She was trying to make this about something it wasn't. She was trying to turn the tables on him, to make herself the victim. Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He needed to stay focused. He decided to head back home, make sure everything was set, and prepare for whatever was coming. The next few hours felt like a waiting game. Jake wasn't sure when the police would show up or how long Karen could keep up her act, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to end quietly. As he arrived at his house, he walked toward the garage and couldn't help but notice Karen's car still sitting there, locked in. The longer she stayed in the garage, the more desperate she would become. And the more desperate she got, the more mistakes she'd make. Jake knew Karen too well to think she would just accept defeat. She was going to fight back, and he needed to be ready for her next move. The sound of sirens in the distance made Jake pause. He could hear the police coming. It wouldn't be long now. The sirens grew louder, getting closer, and Jake steeled himself for what was about to unfold. He wasn't about to let Karen get away with turning this into a drama. He had done nothing wrong, and he was ready to stand by his actions. When the police arrived, they wouldn't find a criminal. They would find a man who was simply protecting his property. The sirens stopped outside his house, and Jake could see the flashing lights through the window. He walked toward the door, preparing himself for the inevitable. The doorbell rang. He opened it slowly, keeping his face calm, neutral. 2 officers stood on the other side, their expressions serious but not unfriendly. One of them looked at Jake. "We've received a call about an incident here," the officer said, glancing at the house behind Jake. "A woman is locked in your garage. Is that correct?" Jake nodded slowly, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, that's correct. She parked her car in my garage without permission, so I locked the door. She had no right to park there." The officers exchanged glances but said nothing. "Do you have any proof of that?" the second officer asked. Jake nodded again. "I have witnesses who saw her park there, and I have the video footage from my security cameras. She can't deny it." The officers didn't say anything for a moment, looking over their notes. The tension in the air was palpable. Jake could feel the weight of the situation. But he wasn't going to back down. He knew he was in the right. "If you'd like to speak to her, she's still inside," Jake said calmly, gesturing to the locked garage door behind him. The tension in the air thickened as Jake stood face to face with the police officers. They had been quiet for a moment, probably processing the situation and weighing their options. Jake could tell they were trying to understand what had happened, but he was ready. He had his story straight, and he knew that the evidence was on his side. Karen had made a huge mistake, and now she would have to face the consequences of her actions. The officers glanced at each other, one of them scribbling something in their notebook. Finally, the first officer spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We need to speak to the woman inside," he said, his eyes scanning Jake's face for any sign of agitation. Jake nodded, stepping aside to let them enter. "She's been making a scene for the past few hours. You'll hear everything she has to say, but just know that she's the one who crossed the line by parking in my garage without permission," Jake said, keeping his voice steady. The officers walked past him, heading toward the garage door. Karen was still inside, no doubt trying to come up with an explanation for the situation. Jake could already imagine her, livid, flustered, and probably trying to pull every string she could. He wasn't worried. This time, Jake wasn't going to back down. He had no reason to be afraid. The officers approached the locked door, one of them knocking loudly. Are you inside?" The sound of Karen's voice echoed from behind the door, her tone sharp and full of frustration. "Yes, I'm here, let me out," she shouted, the panic creeping into her voice. "I've been locked in here for hours. You need to get me out now. Jake has lost his mind." Jake couldn't help but roll his eyes at her dramatic flair. She wasn't even trying to be reasonable. She was just looking for a way to get out without taking responsibility for what she'd done. The officer turned back to Jake, his eyebrows raised. "She seems upset," he remarked. "Maybe she doesn't fully understand the situation." Jake clenched his jaw, taking a deep breath. "She knows exactly what she's done. She parked in my garage without permission, even after I asked her not to. And now she's throwing a tantrum because she's stuck. She has no one to blame but herself." The second officer nodded, turning to the door. "We'll handle it. Please stay here while we speak to her." Jake stepped back, trying not to let his frustration get the best of him. He had done everything by the book, and now he had to trust the police to handle it. He could hear the muffled voices behind the door as the officers spoke to Karen. Her voice was high-pitched, filled with indignation, as she tried to justify her actions. "I'm the HOA president," she shouted. "I have every right to park here. He's just trying to make a big deal out of nothing." Jake could hear the officers speaking to her calmly, explaining the situation, but she wasn't having it. Her sense of entitlement was blinding her, and she wasn't ready to accept that she was wrong. "No one is above the law, Karen," one of the officers said, his voice firm. "You can't just take someone else's property without their permission." The officers continued to speak to her for several minutes. From where Jake stood, he could hear Karen's voice rising in frustration, but it was clear she wasn't getting the sympathy she was hoping for. She wasn't in control anymore, and that realization must have stung. Jake couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped for. Karen needed to understand that there were consequences to her actions, and this was the first real lesson. As the minutes passed, the officers continued to talk to Karen, their voices growing quieter. Eventually, they turned back to Jake, their expressions neutral. "We've spoken to her," the first officer said. "She admits she parked her car here without permission, but she's claiming it was an accident." Jake shook his head, unwilling to let her manipulate the situation. "It wasn't an accident," he said firmly. "She knew exactly what she was doing. She thought she could do whatever she wanted because of her position in the HOA. But she's not above the law." The officer nodded, taking down some notes. "We'll need to file a report. But for now, we're advising her to leave your property and not return without your permission." Jake let out a breath of relief. The officers had done their job, and it looked like Karen wasn't going to get away with this. But Karen wasn't finished yet. As the officers turned to leave, Jake heard her voice rise in the background again, this time laced with threats. "This isn't over, Jake," she yelled. "You'll regret this. I'm going to make sure you pay for locking me in that garage." Jake didn't flinch. He had expected her to lash out, to try to intimidate him. But it didn't matter. He wasn't scared of her. Not anymore. The officers gave him a nod as they walked toward the door. "We've got everything we need. We'll file the report and take it from here," the second officer said. "Just make sure to document everything and keep a record of any further interactions with her." Jake nodded, watching as the officers walked back to their squad car. Karen was still shouting behind him, but Jake was done listening. As the police car pulled away, Jake turned back to the house. He felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of victory that came with loud celebrations or triumphs, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had stood his ground, and he had made sure Karen learned that her actions had consequences. The days after the police left were strange for Jake. On the surface, everything seemed to return to normal. The neighbors went about their business, Karen's car was still locked in his garage, and Jake tried to focus on the tasks at hand. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done with him. He knew she wouldn't just let things go. Her sense of control, her need to dominate the neighborhood, wouldn't allow it. Jake's phone buzzed late one afternoon, pulling him out of his thoughts. He stared at the screen. It was a message from Mike. Karen's at it again. She's threatening to take you to court. Jake's heart sank as he read the message. He had been expecting this, but hearing it made the reality hit hard. He didn't have the luxury of thinking things would just blow over. Karen had already proven she was willing to do whatever it took to make his life miserable, and now she was escalating. She's not going to stop, is she? Jake muttered to himself, staring at the screen. He had tried to play it cool, hoping that Karen would finally realize that she couldn't get away with her behavior. But clearly, she hadn't learned a thing. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer. Jake, what's up? The voice on the other end was calm, but Jake could hear the underlying tension. I just heard from a neighbor, Jake said, his voice tight with frustration. Karen's threatening to take me to court. She's pushing to make this whole thing about me locking her in the garage. I don't know what she's going to try next, but I'm not going to let her win. His lawyer sighed. It's not surprising. We knew she would escalate it. But listen, we've got the law on our side here. She's the one in the wrong. Just make sure you've documented everything. The more evidence we have, the better. Jake nodded, though he felt anything but reassured. He had already documented the initial incident, the conversations with neighbors, and the video footage from his security cameras. But Karen was relentless, and her connections in the HOA and local community made her a formidable opponent. I'm not worried about the legal side of it, Jake said, his tone more determined. I'm worried about what she's willing to do. She thinks she can get away with anything because of her position. And now she's going to make me pay for standing up to her. I know, his lawyer replied. But don't let her control the situation. Keep your head clear and stick to the facts. We'll handle the legal side. Just make sure she doesn't get to you emotionally. Jake leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation pressing on him. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. But now, Karen had pushed him into a corner. And Jake didn't like being cornered. The phone call ended, and Jake found himself standing by the window, looking out at the quiet street. He could see Karen's house in the distance, the lights flickering as if mocking him, as if she were waiting for the next move. Karen had always believed she was untouchable. Now, Jake had to make sure she realized that no one was above the law, not even her. The sound of his front door opening broke his thoughts. He turned just as Max, his loyal dog, trotted into the room. Max's eyes were calm, but Jake could see the subtle shift in his posture. Even the dog seemed to sense the tension that had settled over the house. Jake crouched down to pet Max, feeling a small sense of comfort. He didn't have much of a choice now. He was in this fight whether he wanted to be or not. And there was no going back. But he wasn't afraid. He had stood his ground before, and he wasn't going to back down now. He had to be smart about this, play the long game, and outmaneuver Karen at every turn. He couldn't just let her win, not after everything she had done. But Jake knew it wasn't just about Karen anymore. This had become a matter of principle. He wasn't going to let someone like her push him around, especially when he was in the right. He had worked too hard to let her ruin everything. The next few days felt like a blur. Jake stayed on high alert, waiting for Karen's next move, trying to stay one step ahead of her. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. He spent time gathering more evidence, keeping an eye on Karen's movements, and trying to find any weaknesses in her defense. But Karen wasn't going to make it easy. Every time Jake thought she was backing off, she would make another move, another threat. The phone calls from her allies in the HOA increased. Her attempts to turn the tables on him grew more desperate. Karen was clearly on a warpath, and it wasn't just about the garage anymore. It was about her pride. Her need to be in control. Jake had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to handle. One afternoon, as he was sorting through some papers in his office, the doorbell rang. He froze. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect anymore. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Karen standing there. Instead, it was a man in a suit. He introduced himself as a process server, and before Jake could react, the man handed him a stack of papers. Jake's eyes quickly scanned the documents. It was a lawsuit. Karen had officially filed against him, claiming damages for her unlawful detention in the garage. She was demanding compensation for emotional distress, lost wages, and other expenses. Jake's stomach turned. He had expected this. Karen wouldn't back down without a fight. But seeing it in writing made it all the more real. The weight of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. This was no longer just a petty battle over parking spaces. This was a full-on war, and Karen had just made her first official move. Jake's mind raced as he processed the situation. She was throwing everything at him, using every weapon in her arsenal. But Jake had one thing she didn't have: resolve. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let Karen drag him into her web of lies and manipulation. He was going to fight, and he was going to win. There was no turning back now.